Welcome to the lecture for week 3. This week we'll be looking at European empires, particularly European empires in the early Atlantic world. And the event that starts us off today is Columbus gets laughed out of King Joao's court. And the date for this is 1484. Now, part of the background here is that Columbus, whose name is in original language would have been Cristoforo Colombo, was a merchant, and he was originally from the city-state of Genoa. He was active trading in the Mediterranean as part of European trading networks for most of his life. He traveled all across the Mediterranean. He traveled to Africa. And he's emblematic of a set of connections, particularly between what the area that we now know as Italy, the kind of Italian city-states, and Portugal. And both Portugal and many Italian city-states, certainly the ones that had cities along the coast, like Venice, Genoa being the two big ones, were big maritime traders. They moved goods across the Mediterranean, and the Portuguese moved goods in the Atlantic, usually from the Mediterranean to places in Northern Europe, whether it was sort of northern France or England or beyond to the Netherlands and Scandinavia. And Columbus was part of that group. Now, Columbus knew that there was a pressing need to be able to get access to goods from the Far East. And part of that has to do with the way that things were changing in the Mediterranean, and I'll come back to that in just a second. And he had an idea that you could go west to get east. And so the first point that I want to make here as part of this event is that that's not new. Anyone that he was involved with knew that the world was a sphere. That was not in question. It was not a doubt in anyone's mind that the world was a sphere. But what people didn't know was what was to the west of Europe until you got to the east. Everyone knew you could do it. Everyone knew that theoretically one could travel either by sea or overland. If you got to land eventually, keep going west, and eventually you'd get to the east. The problem was that no one knew how far the sea that we now know as the Atlantic stretched to the west before you got to something. And the event that I have here is all about the fact that Columbus, his idea was not that you could go west to get east, but his idea was that the world was smaller than it is. And that's why twice he was basically laughed out. I don't know if they actually laughed at him. I'm using that a bit hyperbolically, but 2 times he went to the King of Portugal and said, why don't you give me some ships and some money and I will go on this voyage for you. And the King of Portugal and his advisors said, your math is bad. And the image here gives you a sense of what's going on, right? Columbus, for whatever reason, didn't believe that the math that everyone else was using to determine how big the Earth was, which was a known problem. It's something that Europeans had known for, by this point, over 1,500 years or more, how big the Earth was. And he disagreed. He was basically the flat Earth theorist almost, although obviously not flat Earth. But he was saying that conventional wisdom was wrong and that the distance was much shorter between the western part of Europe and then the sort of eastern edge of the Far East. And so he was turned down. And it wasn't until he went to the neighbors of Portugal, to the court of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, that he got some support. And he got support there not because people believed that his math was right, but rather because even if his math wasn't right, if he succeeded in some way, it would be good for them. And we'll come to why that is in just a second. But the point here is that Columbus should be famous not for knowing that the Earth was a sphere, but actually for being a bad mathematician and believing that the Earth was far smaller than it actually was, and in fact was roundly denounced for good reason for those ideas. We're going to talk here in the first part of the lecture on Portugal and Spain, and then we'll come to England, France, and the Netherlands in the second part of the lecture. The first part of the lecture here, the setup is that the European networks of trade were changing radically in the 1400s. And you can see on the sort of big map to the right, the various networks of trade that connected Europe to the rest of the world. And as you can see, the sort of classic Silk Roads that kind of go overland through Central Asia and then into the Near East and via Constantinople and the Black Sea into Europe. As I mentioned, the Portuguese were traders on the last leg of those lines. That they moved things by boat that had already come into the Mediterranean. They might have already been sort of shipped from merchants in the East or by merchants in Italy, and were carrying those goods into the Atlantic and then up to Northern Europe. The problem that happens, particularly after the middle part of the 1400s, is that the Ottoman Empire has taken control of the entire sort of eastern portion of the Mediterranean. And so things that were coming through these trade routes were suddenly getting more expensive. And as a result of that, the Portuguese, as merchants, recognized that there was a possibility of increasing their profits by cutting out middlemen. But the only way to cut out middlemen would be to get around the Ottoman Empire. And they knew that they couldn't do that through the Eastern Mediterranean. The only way to do it would be finding a seaborne route. And the thing is that this was much more known to the Portuguese because they already knew at least what the northern part of Africa looked like. So the Portuguese in the 1400s begin to increase their trade with Africa as a way of moving their trading networks in a new direction to hopefully, in the long run, get around the sort of increased tax zone, if you will, of the Ottoman Empire and be able to reach a lot of those goods directly by sea. And they could do that because they knew that Africa probably, if you went far enough south, you could get around it. And they also knew not only that you could get around it, that there were places to trade with there that still had things that they wanted. And so if you look at the map on the right, particularly those trade lines that go south through northern Africa, that's what we call the trans-Saharan trade. That was already, by the mid-1400s, a known route for getting things like gold and ivory, and even at this early date, enslaved peoples. That there was already a trade in enslaved peoples across the Sahara Desert at this point. So the Portuguese knew that there were at least three things that Europeans wanted, ivory and gold being first and foremost, but also a sort of growing market for slaves, that could be had if you could continue to reach those trading networks by going around Africa. The other thing that I'll point out here is if you look at the map of the sort of Europe at the time, the empires that we're talking about are heirs to other empires. And I don't think I have to belabor that too much. There is at this point in time the Holy Roman Empire, although it's not hugely coherent and never really is a coherent empire in the way that its predecessor, the Roman Empire, was. But a point that I would want to make here early on is that right now the dominant power, the sort of singular dominant power, is probably France. That of European states, kingdoms at the time, France is by far and away the strongest. And so most other European kingdoms are sort of in competition with France. Certainly England has had a sort of on-again, off-again competition with France, having a lot to do with the legacies of rulers. The kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, Castile, Aragon, are all having their own encounters with France, whether it's through trade. As I'll talk about in a little bit, the Kingdom of Aragon is actually fighting with France over the parts of Italy and the sort of central Mediterranean area there. And so a lot of the empires that we're looking at that go into the Atlantic are empires that are doing that in order to get the upper hand of France and obviously all of the other kingdoms that we're looking at. But turning back to Portugal, what we see especially during the 1400s and the 1500s, is a real, almost systematic expansion. And importantly, what the Portuguese are doing is building a trading empire. And there's a couple sort of principles and a couple foundations to that empire. Most importantly, the Portuguese have some of the best sailing technology of the period. They have developed a ship type called the caravel, which is a very advanced ship for its day because it can be rigged in many different ways. You can change how the sails work. It can travel in relatively shallow waters, but it can also go deep out at sea. So it's actually a very versatile ship, especially if you're going to places you don't really know very well. It's also, for the time, relatively spacious, right? So again, if you're interested in cargo and trade, you want a spacious ship. They also have the support financially of Italian merchants, right? And again, the sort of Columbus, who he is, he's not the only Italian who's in Portugal. There's a lot of long-standing relationships between merchants in Portugal and Italian houses that they're working together and financing each other. And so they're getting money for this from existing trading networks. And importantly, a lot of that is private. A lot of these expeditions are not being funded by the King of Portugal. They're being funded privately. Now, many times they go to the King of Portugal to make sure that they sort of have the support of the king, and maybe try and establish monopolies on trade if they make connections. But they are privately funded, and they're being funded through a relatively international connection of merchants that, at least in the early period, is heavily involved with Italian merchants. And the final point is, when they're getting to these places, because they're interested in trade, they're not, for the most part, directly conquering territory. Now, that's not exclusively true. There are some places where the Portuguese will take over and claim territory. For example, some of the islands off the coast of Africa. On the map there, you can see things like the Azores, Madeira, Cape Verde. It doesn't quite show you, but there's also Sao Tome. There's some small islands that they take entire control of. But for the most part, what the Portuguese are doing are establishing trading posts. And the term that they use for that is feitoria. And the picture you have over there is a sort of, as a drawing of what one might look like. This one's particularly fortified, so it looks like a little bit of a fort. And that's not entirely wrong. They were often fortified because, again, they're not controlling, they're not conquering the land. They're often establishing relationships with local rulers and then establishing warehouses where they can trade goods that they've brought from Portugal with local merchants and store them until they can take them back to Portugal. And so the feitorias that they establish are basically fortified storehouses for things that they have already traded, or they are about to trade, or that they have received in trade from the merchants that they encounter. It's actually the same word as we get for factory, because the merchants, the actual people that are on the ground in Africa, in these ports that they've gone into, are called factors. And factors negotiate trades and manage the actual transfer of goods between merchants. And so basically the Portuguese are going and establishing these trading relationships with particular cities and kingdoms in Africa, and then sort of building that trade. They're not just going down and coming back and staying away, that they're actually building a network of these factories along the coast, and merchant houses in Portugal begin to specialize in trade to particular places. That process sort of continues. So even after we know Columbus does find something to the west of Europe, this process is going to continue. And you can see on the map here that into the 1490s, early 1500s, they eventually get to India. Eventually, they'll go beyond India, and they continue this process of establishing trading posts, feitorias, factories, all the way to places like Indonesia and beyond. And for the most part, that's what Portuguese empire looks like, except when they do end up taking territory. So the sort of two places that I'm going to talk about really briefly right now are the two places in the South Atlantic where they do establish territorial holdings. The first one is Brazil, and the second one is a place that is at first called Luanda after its port, but eventually gets the name Angola. It's possible, some people argue that the Portuguese knew of lands in the Western Atlantic before Columbus went out, because some of these voyages that went down the African coast, they actually swung out way to the west in the Atlantic to get favorable winds, especially as they were trying to get down all the way south and around Africa. And so there's some relatively legitimate claims to be made that some of these voyages that were trying to get to southern Africa actually saw the coast of Brazil. And it's very likely that when, in the wake of Columbus discovering the Caribbean, the Portuguese knew that there was something there. And so what happens in 1493, the year after Columbus sort of comes back from his voyage, is that the Spanish and the Portuguese negotiate a division, a separation of spheres of influence. And they draw a line in the middle of the Atlantic. It's not really the Atlantic, it's sort of way out into the Atlantic. And in the negotiations, the Portuguese keep wanting to move that line to the west. And some argue that that's because they actually knew that there was land there, and the land that they get is Brazil. So in 1493, this division, which is established by the Treaty of Tordesillas, gives Portugal a claim, at least in terms of European powers, to eastern South America, what will become Brazil. But it's not really developed in the 1490s. Even in the early 1500s, it's not very well developed, in large part because they're having so much success establishing these factories on the African coastline, and then the ones that they at that moment are beginning to open up in the Indian Ocean. And so it takes a while for them to begin to send people to try and actually settle or colonize in Brazil. And in large part, it's actually because other European powers, in particular the French, are going there and trying to steal land. There's a couple of French expeditions that try and settle there. So the Portuguese begin to develop it. But the model for certainly the creation of territorial colonies in the Atlantic world for Portugal is based on a relationship between sugar and slavery. And very early on, some of the islands that they get in the Atlantic, whether it's Madeira or Cape Verde, they begin to grow sugarcane. And in order to meet the labor demands of growing sugar, they need to rely on slaves that they're purchasing from some of these factories on the African coast. And so they develop a paradigm for using enslaved African workers to grow sugarcane. And then as Brazil begins to sort of be settled, that paradigm transfers over from places like Madeira and becomes the predominant mode of production in Brazil. And eventually, as I said, there's this kingdom called Angola, based out of the port of Luanda, that is established in large part because a major source of enslaved labor is in that part of Africa. And they'd already established connections to an African kingdom called the Kingdom of Congo. And because of politics in the region, the Portuguese take the opportunity, or sort of use an opportunity, to conquer a neighboring kingdom to the south, and establish their own kingdom next to their trading partner, Congo. And that allows them a sort of constant source of enslaved laborers that then can be sent to Brazil. And so certainly the sort of territorial growth of Portugal's empire in the Atlantic world is based on sugar production in some form, initially on these Atlantic islands, later in Brazil, and the use of enslaved African labor as the primary labor force for that production. Now, turning to the other early empire that's formed, Spain. Well, Spain doesn't really exist in 1492. It exists as two separate but very closely related kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, both of which, and Portugal is included here, had been part of a process called the Reconquista, the Reconquest, which began in the 8th century as Christian kingdoms in the very, very north of the Iberian Peninsula began to reconquer land that had been taken by Muslim armies in the 8th century. And what we end up getting, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but basically what happens is that by the 1300s, you have three major kingdoms. You have Portugal, we've talked about. You have Castile, which is sort of in the middle of the peninsula, and you have Aragon, which is on the east coast of the peninsula. And of these three, Portugal and Aragon in some ways are the most successful. Portugal, as we talked about, is sort of set itself up as this trader from the Mediterranean to Northern Europe. Aragon, as you can see in the map on the right, is actually engaging in its own empire. During the sort of 13th, 14th, 15th century, it's actually expanding into the Mediterranean. It conquers the Balearic Islands, it conquers Sardinia, Sicily, the southern part of the Italian peninsula, Naples, and it's actually created its own little empire in that region. Castile is the one that's left out. But the story of Castile and Aragon come together in the 1460s and 1470s when the two, basically a prince and a princess, are married. So Isabella, who's the princess of Castile, and Ferdinand, who's a prince in Aragon, are married in 1469. By the time they both become monarchs of their own kingdoms, then they sort of, those kingdoms are then working together. And that's complete in 1479, when Ferdinand of Aragon becomes king of Aragon. Isabella of Castile had already become queen of Castile by that point. But in 1479, then, they are both monarchs of their kingdoms. And part of their marriage agreement was that they would be co-monarchs, meaning not just that Isabel was queen of Castile, but that Aragon also was king of Castile. And likewise, they sort of shared the monarchies. But the reason why this is important is that in 1492, when Columbus comes and offers the same deal that he did to the King of Portugal, to the two of them, he gets a different answer. And he gets a different answer from Isabella. And the answer is, sure, I'll give you a little bit of money to do this thing. And she gives him that answer because Castile doesn't have any real overseas holdings. It's been hemmed in between these two kind of seaborne expanding kingdoms, and really it doesn't have anywhere else to go other than maybe just over into North Africa. So the deal that is made between Columbus is not between Columbus and Ferdinand and Isabella, but really it's between Columbus and Isabella as Queen of Castile. And Aragon doesn't have anything to do with the agreement, which is important in the long history of things, because the kingdoms that are sort of conquered in the Americas are technically made part of Castile and not part of Aragon. But the short answer why is that Ferdinand already had things that he was dealing with. And at this point in time, he's actually more worried about France and competition in northern Italy than he is about whatever Columbus might find in the Western Atlantic. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the Spanish conquest because, one, it's my specialty, so I could spend an entire series of lectures on it. But I do want to hit on a few aspects that defines the conquest and kind of defines what the empire that's forged from that looks like. So one of the first points here, and it's the same point as I made with Portugal, is that these are privately funded. That Isabella is not paying, she pays a little bit of money to get Columbus's expedition going. But once they have discovered the islands of the Caribbean, and there are more ventures going there, and certainly once we get to the 1510s, 1520s, and you have a lot more of these expeditions of conquest actually taking over territory, those are privately financed. People go to the king and queen to ask permission, and also to make sure that if they succeed, the king or queen will back them and give them privilege for having succeeded, but they're paying for it themselves. These are private expeditions. There's not a Spanish army doing any of this. A lot of people have had military experience fighting in the wars of reconquest that had only ended in 1492, but there is no standing army that's being used for this. The second point is, because it's privately funded, these ventures need to make money, right? People are putting money out on the line to do it. They need to get money back. Just like with Portugal, the investors that are funding those Portuguese voyages want to establish trade routes to get stuff back. And actually, initially, Columbus was using the Portuguese model. He thought that he would just set up factories in the New World. That ended up not being what happened for a variety of reasons, in large part because there wasn't that many things to trade that really were valuable or could be consistently valuable back in Europe. And the second part is that other than Columbus, a lot of the sort of actual people from Castile and Aragon that were going on these voyages didn't really want to set up a mercantile empire. They wanted a territorial conquest. So what they're looking for is things that you can trade and make money, sources of wealth like silver and gold. And they want to find places where there are lots of people, because where there's lots of people, there's trade. And if you can't trade, you can at least conquer those people and extract wealth and labor from them. Again, all of which because these expeditions need to make money. And so what we see then is a process by which these private expeditions go out. They are very conscious in targeting Native American groups that are sizable, that appear to have precious metals or other valuable commodities, and that once they've conquered them, they establish institutions. The most notable one is the encomienda, which is an institution by which a Spaniard is given authority over an indigenous community and allowed to demand tribute and labor from that community. And that is a mechanism by which then those Spaniards are able to then recoup their investment in the voyage. In the case of the Caribbean, the warfare of conquest and the excesses of that system of the encomienda of Spaniards extracting wealth and labor decimated the indigenous population, and effectively was an effective genocide, even if it was not an intentional one. What we also see in the case of the Spanish conquest is, just like the Portuguese, there's a sort of staged process to it. As the Portuguese went farther down the African coast, they could then keep going farther. You see the same thing in terms of Spanish conquest. It starts on Hispaniola, then it spreads to other islands of the Caribbean, then it spreads to the mainland. And so one area becomes the base for the next expansion. What is true, and the last point that I want to make here, is that initially, because of the relationship between private companies, conquest, and the king, initially the agreements that these private groups make with the king are to allow them to govern. And in part, that explains one reason why when they do conquer peoples, especially the large empires, things like the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, they don't really change the way that the empire is structured, because what's happened is simply that the Spanish company has taken over the top of that empire, and they're not interested in changing it. They're simply interested in being at the top and extracting from it. And so a lot of times, especially in the early period, the fact that these are the conquistadors are given the power, the right to rule, leads them not to change too much of how indigenous peoples are already governing themselves, because they're simply inserting themselves at the top, or they're putting things like the encomienda on top of already existing communities. And it's only over time that the king begins to take away the encomienda, or to say, okay, you've governed for 5 years now after the conquest, I'm sending out my new governor who's going to take over, and you get this position or this privilege. And so what we see is a transition over years and decades in some cases, from a sort of government, a very light government on the ground that's basically the conquistadors governing the people they conquered through the institutions of those indigenous people, to a framework where there are royal officials being sent out from Spain who are then trying to create a much more sort of systematic and hierarchical framework for imperial rule. So I'm going to pause here, and part 2 is going to turn to other European empires, England, France, and the Netherlands.